No, John Lettieri, this is named after John Lettieri. The four crafted cocktail names are going to be unveiled now for those of you who have the endurance. Lettieri's Labor Market Mojito. The Glickman, you know Steve was up here, Glickman GDP Gimlet. The Vague Value-Based Vesper. And then the final drink is called When Life Gives You Clemens. Anyway, with that, so we're going to have fun. So this has been, for me, every bit of it is an outstanding conference, an outstanding day, and it's hitting the marks that I want. But this next session may be the only part that matters. And I don't want to put any pressure on, but mapping the Trump administration's economic course, we, of course, have Kevin Hassett, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Of course, I mentioned Kevin's work at the American Enterprise Institute before, and he was author of the paper with Jared Bernstein that led to Opportunity Zones. So while Senators Tim Scott and Cory Booker up here taking a lot of credit, you know that actually Kevin and Jared did the real work. So with that, and to interview him, we have Megan McArdle, former colleague of mine at The Atlantic, and now a columnist at The Washington Post. Please welcome them to the stage.
I think you're supposed to sit in the middle, they said.
Yes. It's very roomy up here.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So
why
Kevin,
do you
tell
feel
me about
that
your
way?
relationship with your father.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to dive right in because we have a hard out at 12:05. I'm going to start by asking you about regulation.
Mm-hmm.
You told Jason Furman recently, regulatory costs in the U.S. over the last decade were growing 8% a year. We have the example in the economic report that if we change our level of regulation to that of Germany, then we get an extra 0.1% of GDP. And if we go all the way to as reckless about regulation as the Netherlands, then you get 0.2% a year of GDP growth. How are we doing on that?
Yeah, well, we've made a lot of progress, and I think deregulation, I see Paul London in the front. I think it's hard to see through the bright lights, but Paul wrote a fantastic book for the American Enterprise Institute on the history of deregulation and other things, and points out that most of the deregulation that Ronald Reagan gets credit for was started by Jimmy Carter. And so that there's a long bipartisan agreement, I think, that probably hit a roadblock at the financial crisis. That deregulation is a key source of growth, potentially. And so we have a whole bunch of facts that we could put up. I could even tweet them today if you want to see what the charts look like about the progress that the Trump administration is making on deregulation. And it's really quite impressive. But basically, we've more or less stopped new regulation in its tracks. And the number of pages in the Federal Register has gone down by like 30–40%, which is even more of an accomplishment if you think that if you remove a regulation, then that takes a page in the Federal Register. And so I think if you look at business sentiment, small business sentiment especially, it's skyrocketing, I think, because of deregulation more than anything else.
So what is the biggest success in your opinion? In what area has deregulation been the biggest success so far?
Well, there's a massive amount of movement of tiny little things, and so I honestly think that
Death of 1,000 cuts.
Well, the thing is that it's something that we studied in the beginning because the sentiment took off so much that I asked the CEA staff, it's about 50 economists and support staff, what it was that was causing. Capital spending took off before the tax cuts were passed and so on, and business sentiment was skyrocketing. And after some careful study, we found something that I had never seen in the literature before, but that we believe to be true by talking to real people on the front lines, real businesses. And it's this, that if there's some old regulation that we roll back, and we've certainly been doing that, then that has an effect. But old regulations are almost like sunk costs for firms. So if we have a new regulation, then I figure out, what do I do with the new regulation? I hire all these lawyers, and my engineers tell me whether I got to use different machines and so on. And so it can cost me millions of dollars to figure out how to comply with a new regulation. But once I figured it out, then more or less my business functions. And so I'd say that the big surprise for me was, which is a little different than picking an individual one, was that when we stopped new regulations in their tracks, that you sort of got skyrocketing sentiment and behavior. And I think it was because there was this asymmetry in the cost of regulation, and the new regulations are especially costly that I had never thought about before.
So is the administration done on that front? Is there more, what still remains to be done on deregulation?
Well, I think that again, the agencies are knocking things down one by one, and that will continue. And so, yeah, I don't think that our deregulatory agenda is accomplished at all. And I look forward to watching things like the OECD and World Bank measures of regulatory costs and sort of hoping that we get those things on a downtrend. And again, when you think about deregulation, then you worry perhaps, so does that mean that we're going to have dirty air or something like that? But that's why we used in the economic report of the president the example of Germany or the Netherlands, because if our regulation could get all the way down to the level of the Netherlands, then that's 2% of GDP over 10 years. It's kind of remarkable that how much regulation is spun out of control. And I think part of it is that there's this thing in Washington that I see now, even watching it from inside government really for the first time, which is that every new group of people wants to accomplish their own things, and so they tend to pile regulations on top of previous regulations without trying to repeal the previous ones too. And so you end up getting this big mess of stuff, and there's going to be a lot to clean out still.
So
and Naomi Rao, by the way, is doing a fantastic job at that, and they just put out a report a couple of months ago on what they've done in the last year.
So let me move on to a topic that is, I think, near and dear to your heart, which is opportunity zones. Got that into the tax bill. What's the progress on that, and what remains to be done? Is Treasury,
Sure.
When is Treasury going to issue guidance? What needs to happen going forward? Because it's a pretty tight time frame, as I understand it.
Yeah, so opportunity zones, I'm sure that they're going to be mentioned a lot here, and I again congratulate EIG for its leadership on that policy area, and Sean Parker too, because Sean, a long time ago, before he founded EIG, asked to meet with me because somebody said that I'm the guy he should talk to about his cool tax idea. So I went to Sean's house in New York City then about 10 years ago or 11 years ago, and then he started talking about something that ended up being the opportunity zone idea. Then all the work that we've done at EIG before I went into the White House really started from Sean having the insight that this is a really great way to lead to a new equilibrium in society. So I think that I just want to say, going back to someone mentioned Jared and I wrote a paper about it, I wanted to remind everybody the basic thought is that we had these Jack Kemp enterprise zones in the past and a bunch of other tax products like that, but they weren't really ever viewed to be very successable. And
that is because, in fact, they weren't very successful, right?
Yeah, well, I think that's probably right, yes. The point is that there are different flavors of them, and there's one flavor that maybe was successful, and so that's why my language was a little less harsh. But it was always very small. It didn't have a big effect. My view is, and Jared and I wrote about this, that the problem was that they tended to try to incent investment in distressed areas with like these special rules that made it so that you really had to make a business yourself. Like, so if you wanted to help Anacostia right now, then you have to go make a business yourself in Anacostia, and your workers have to live in Anacostia, and you should probably live in Anacostia too. So there are all these constraints that were well-intentioned, but made it so that very little capital was targeted towards opportunity zones. And the basic fundamental idea that Jared and Sean and I really at the beginning had was that, and I'm sure we could do this now, that there are a lot of people in this room that want to make a difference for distressed communities. You know how terrible the geographic inequality in our country is, and you really wish you could help, but you don't know how. You don't know what to do. And so really what's going on with the opportunity zones is that we think that we're leading away from this, what we call Nash equilibrium, where nobody goes, to a Nash equilibrium where everybody goes. And the way we do that is that we've made it so that there are these new financial vehicles that allow you to, say, take your money from your Vanguard index fund, roll it over into an investment vehicle that will invest in distressed communities, and then you can take your personal wealth and use it to help the distressed areas. And so our view is that because we believe in the basic goodness of Americans, that Americans want to help, that they're going to do this, they're going to make money doing it. and they're going to make money doing it because it'll create the positive Nash equilibrium where everybody goes. And so we think that in the fullness of time, there'll be tens of billions of dollars of money invested in these funds and basically heading right back to the distressed communities. And so where are we with it? Sorry for the little valedictory address, but I want to remind the audience. But where are we with this? Well, there's been a lot of really good news. The states, one of the things that the bill said is that the states should decide which communities are distressed. And of course, there was a concern that one might have that the states would mess that up. But if you look at the choices that the states have made, they're really solid. I've had my staff brief me on the characteristics of the communities that have been that qualify now as distressed communities, and they're precisely the hardest hit places in those states, the places that are most in need of help. The next step is that the sort of financial regulations have to be finalized by Treasury, which we expect will happen over the summer. And then really by the fall, I think that this thing is going to lift off.
Let's move on to taxes then, since this is obviously a kind of the big signature policy achievement of the administration so far. And why haven't we seen sort of big wage growth out of the tax bill? What should we be looking for, and what do we do about the deficits that the tax bill has?
Okay, so let's think about the channel that the tax bill works through, and this goes back to work that when Paul and I were having lunch at the AEI dining room 20 years ago, that I was working on it even back then. That what happened is we cut the cost of capital, and the cost of capital going down means that there'll be more capital formation. I think the elasticity is about 1. And so in the fall, you guys might recall, if you were watching the CEA output, that we said that investment should go up by about 9% because the cost of capital went down by about 9%. Well, in the first quarter advanced GDP release, capital spending in the U.S. went up by 9.2%. I think we were off by 0.1% with our model. And so what happens is that you get a capital spending boom, which is underway. And again, it's matching very much the predictions of our models, even in the cross-section. It's great when you model something and it has a surprising result and then you see it in the data. It's kind of a proof of model for me. One of those was that probably it'll surprise everyone here to hear that the tax bill that we just passed reduced the cost of capital for structures more than equipment. And you would say, wait, how could that be? Because structures, they don't get expensing. And the answer is that the tax rate matters more for really long-lived assets. And so that we had the structures cost of capital dropping 14%, whereas for equipment it was like 8%. And sure enough, in the first quarter, structures investment went up about 16% now, I guess, in the revision. And so you're seeing in the cross-section that the capital spending boom is happening. And so what that does is it takes a while. So the investment jumps in the model, and then the capital grows slowly because investment is, say, about 10% of capital usually. And then as the capital stock goes up, then productivity goes up and wages go up. And so our estimate in the fall was that wages would go up, say, between $3,000 and $5,000, and the president kept picking the middle of that range and saying $4,000 over 3 to 5 years because that's how long it would take the capital to accumulate. The thing that I think is interesting is that wages are going up a lot faster than our models suggested. And I think that economists will be puzzling over exactly why the wage increases are so much quicker than our model suggested. It could be the fact that we're close to full employment is part of it. But as an example, we have more than, we keep anecdotal evidence. We have more than 6 million firms that have announced pay increases since the tax bill passed. On the average of those pay increases is about $1,200. And the employment cost index is up now at an annual rate, if you annualize it, the last 3 months at 4% a year, which is serious real wage growth. And so I think that we are seeing the wage increases, and if you think that the 4,000 number seems a little implausible to you, which certainly some people asserted in the fall, sometimes the best way to make something seem plausible is with counterexample. One of the firms that announced the pay increase is Walmart, which is increasing the pay for their lowest workers, or their minimum wage lowest skill workers, by $2 an hour. If that worker's full time, that's almost $4,000 just this year. And so if the lowest paid guy at Walmart is getting the $4,000 this year, then you would have to say that the wages are surprising on the upside, not the down.
What about the borrowing to fund the tax cuts? I mean, there's a lot that I personally liked on the simplification side of the tax bill, but it wasn't paid for, and we're now looking at some fairly large, scary deficits. And do you worry about crowding out and the effect that will have on investment?
Sure. We are looking at large deficits, and there are a lot of reasons why. But if we're staying on the tax topic, let's look at the tax topic in isolation for a moment. The static cost, according to the Joint Tax Committee of the tax bill, was about $1.5 trillion, and about $400 billion of that was the corporate tax side, and $1.1 trillion was the individual side. And on the corporate tax side, and that's the static cost. And on the corporate side, it was so low, even though we got the rate down from 35 to 21, because there are all these international tax rules that sort of clawed money back from big multinationals. And so it was almost a revenue neutral. $40 billion a year is a pretty small cost for getting the rate down. And if you consider that since the bill passed, if we compare, say, the CBO's GDP forecast from last year to this year, they've increased their GDP growth estimate cumulatively to the point where over the next 10 years, they now think that we'll have 6 trillion more GDP than they thought last year. And so I think the CBO and the Joint Tax Committee were excessively pessimistic about the growth effects of the bill. They didn't expect anything like the capital spending that our models predicted for the first quarter to happen. But as the data come out, they jack up their forecasts to reflect the latest data. And the latest data now say that we get 6 trillion more GDP, in part because of the tax bill. And so if you have $1 trillion more deficit because of 6 trillion more GDP, I asked you, Megan, is that a trade you would take? And
Well,
I think you're plus 5 trillion. It doesn't mean the deficit's not an issue, but that growth. Now let's just talk about it, because someone on the previous panel said something about how the tax cuts were a giveaway to the rich, and I just wanted to address that thing, which I found just inconsistent with the economic modeling that we've done. That first of all, on the corporate side, our view is that it would lead to a lot of wage growth, because it's the blue-collar workers that need more capital to be more productive. If we give Megan more capital, she's probably not going to be more productive.
I beg your pardon.
I don't think so. You could be productive without capital whatsoever, right? You're right.
Well, I do need a laptop.
But I would say that probably almost everybody here doesn't watch their productivity vary. If you're dirty enough to be in this room, right, your productivity doesn't vary very much depending on what the machines are that are at your place of work. But blue-collar workers, they sure do. And so we predicted that wage growth would be really, really high, especially for blue-collar workers, consistent with the literature. And we're seeing that. In fact, in some data we have that I think, I'm looking at my chief of staff right now, who I won't name, but I think that we're about to make this chart public, right? Can I reference the? Yes, DJ Norquist. But yeah, we're seeing that actually, in terms of wage growth, that it's biggest at the bottom right now in some data that we have, and so then you're going to start to say, well, what about the individual side? Well, on the individual side, really the biggest cost was the big expanded refundable child credit. Which you could make an argument for in terms of equalizing opportunity, but if about 700 billion of the 1.1 trillion on the individual side is coming from a refundable child credit, then it's hardly a tax cut giveaway to the rich. And I know that there are distributional tables about the tax rates and stuff like that, but I don't think the individual side has paid for itself yet. And I don't think that was necessarily its intent, because social justice was clearly a target of, say, the child credit.
I have to stop you because we have so little time and
Okay.
so many questions.
Indeed.
Why is the Treasury market pricing in lower growth, lower inflation, or both?
So one of the things that I've been coached carefully on by previous CEA chairs and by the current Treasury Secretary is to not talk about interest rates too much. And it's really out of a deep respect that we have for the independence of the Fed. But I can say that I think that the growth that we have right now, we're really looking at, so I got the latest read on Q2. It's not out yet, but it's looking like it might be around 5%. I'm guessing 4 is still probably a safe bet. And that'll give us a year of growth above 3. And and the year of growth above 3 is really unprecedented. Going back, we have to go way back to before the Great Recession for that to happen. I think that the previous administrations, economists, and maybe Mark Zandi, who was just on stage, is an old friend of mine, kind of convinced everybody that we're in this new normal where we're stuck growing. Remember, economic growth was 1.6% in President Obama's last year. We're in this new normal, and it's kind of exogenously given to us. It's secular stagnation. It's like the evil Martians that are making us grow slow. Had nothing to do with President Obama's policies. That was the story that they spun. And the new normal, I think a lot of people converted to thinking that we're in the new normal, but I and many of my friends at AEI always believed that you could point to specific policies like high corporate tax rates that were leading to low growth and high regulation and big growth of regulations, lots and lots of new regulations every year, and that if we could get out in front of that, then we could go to basically a normal world that wasn't the new normal, it was just normal, and that's 3% growth. And so far, it's clear that we're doing that. And so then the question is it a blip, or are we really back to normal? And I think it's fair, your question basically reflects the observation that I think that enough of the market was convinced by the new normal guys that we're stuck growing slowly forever, that one good year of 3% hasn't really changed their mind about growth 5 years from now. But it's my belief that what's going to happen is we're going to have a 3% growth this year, we're going to have 3% growth next year, and then we're going to ask ourselves next year, well, what about the year after that? And we're going to see that we'll be jacking up our forecasts. And I think as that happens, then one could expect that would affect the yield curve.
Second to last question. Can a country with large trade deficits easily win a trade war?
I think that, and this is really one of my, it's funny, when you write the economic report of the president, it's an enormous amount of work, or the Council of Economic Advisors part of it, and it's about a 600-page book that you get to write in a few months. And I said to my chief of staff that I think I have a better appreciation of what childbirth is like, having put out the economic report of the president, and then she said, "Oh no, you have no idea." Don't ever say that again. But I am allowed to say it, I think, if I say it ironically. But the fact is that one of my favorite chapters is the trade chapter, because
You're not supposed to have favorites among your children.
I know.
Or you're certainly not supposed to admit it if you do.
But they know, don't they? And so, and I think that as an economist, of course, in an economic model, free trade is almost always, in every circumstance, superior to an alternative with tariffs, and it's just because it allows countries to specialize in the things that they're efficient at, and that improves overall efficiency, and that's absolutely true. And then the question is, what do the trade deals agreements that we have in the real world look like? Do they look like what we have in the economic models? And in one of my favorite chapters of the economic report, what we did is we just sort of did an inventory of what trade deals look like. And I know that we don't have a huge amount of time, but I can just sort of summarize it really, really quickly like this, that pretty much what I think happened, what historians will say, is that after the Second World War, that the United States was in a competition with the Soviet Union for influence over the future trajectory and political organization of countries. And that they had their umbrella, we had our umbrella, and we wanted as many countries as possible under our umbrella. And one of the tools that we used to get them under our umbrella was access to our market. And when we gave people access to our market, then we didn't necessarily say that you have to give us access to your market. And so we ended up with really massive trade asymmetries, which we document extensively in the economic report, where basically we unilaterally disarmed, in part as an effort to defeat the Soviet Union, right?
It's been a while since I took economics, but that should make us better off on net, even if they don't disarm, right? We might be better off with access to their markets, but it looks like what's happening now is they're retaliating, and now everyone is worse off because we are now trading less, right?
Well, not yet. But what's going on is that the president is trying to move us towards a new equilibrium where other countries basically treat us symmetrically. And the OECD just put out their report on the US economy a couple of weeks ago, and in there they did a simulation with their models, which are very frontier, cutting-edge models of what would happen to the global economy if everybody around the world adopted US trade policy. It's not exactly the way they did it. They just picked numbers that were pretty much the same as ours and said, what if everybody did that? And the answer was that global GDP goes up a lot, and US welfare goes up even more. Because we're disadvantaged disproportionately by the asymmetries. And so I think that what's genuinely happening right now is that the president is playing hardball to move us to a new equilibrium where people don't treat us so asymmetrically. And there's a special focus on China for a good reason. The economic report of the president discussed different estimates of how much intellectual property China, in an organized way, is stealing from the United States every year, and it's $100 to $500 or $600 billion a year. And it's disruptive to stand up to that. Of course, we could have just been satisfied with the status quo, but that's not really this president's style. And so I think that that's the way to think about what's going on with trade.
But if it fails, do we end up worse off?
I think that if we succeed, then we're better off. And then if you multiply that by -1, then it should be a reasonable estimate of what happens if things were to go the other direction.
So the expected value, you think, is greater than 1, but
it's positive, yes.
I think it's positive, but there is a potential for negative.
Right, and this is informed in part because I interact frequently with the people who are doing the trade negotiations with our partners, and I think that we're all very optimistic that things like the negotiations with Mexico are moving forward very well right now, and so I think that what you need to do if you're the president who wrote the book, The Art of the Deal, is you need to get deals, right? I mean, that's his brand, that's what he's working on, and his people understand it, and so sure, I know that there's uncertainty when you're trying to change a status quo that's unacceptable for us, and that's the sort of part of the story we're living through now. But I think that the end game is deals that the OECD even thinks would be really good for the global economy.
So the last question, my understanding is that you got your PhD at the University of Pennsylvania.
It's true.
That is my alma mater. So to close off, I would just like to ask your favorite Penn fight song.
Oh. Well, the thing is that as a PhD student, I never paid attention to sports at Penn, except for intramural touch football.
You were smarter than the undergraduates.
But I was an undergraduate at Swarthmore, and the thing that I loved best about Swarthmore is, and I don't know if this is the official mascot name, but the Penn, they're the Quakers.
The Fighting Quakers.
The Fighting Quakers, it's true. But at Swarthmore, the mascot is the Fighting Little Quaker. And so we were the Fighting Little Quakers, and I could tell you a lot, but I don't know any songs.
This is really sad.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I feel like you missed a key part of the Penn experience.
Well, thank you
thank
very
you so
much
much,
for
Megan.
talking to us.
And thank you guys, and congratulations to EIG on its
Yes.
9th summit.
Thank you, Megan McArdle. Thank you, Kevin Hassett. Hey, will you come back next year this time, a year from now, if you still have your job? Okay, Kevin. Thank you so much. Big round of applause. Kevin Hassett, Megan McArdle. Thank you so much. So let me tell you about this next stage. We're going to feed you. The EIG staff have been feverishly making about 300 more sandwiches, mustard, knocking off some chickens and stuff. No, we actually have food for everyone. But here's the deal. This is sort of a time for networking. It's time for cell phones. We're going to open these doors in the back. If you want to skip the sandwiches and the healthy stuff, there are great cookies at the end of the line. Don't wait. Just go for them. And bring your food back. And we're going to give you guys about 45 minutes to reconvene here. And I'm going to chair the session next with the ambassadors of France, Gerard Arode, ambassador of Singapore, Ashok Mirpuri, the Deputy Ambassador of Canada, Kirsten Hillman, and I'm making James Crabtree the Ambassador of India since he's the former Mumbai Bureau Chief of the Financial Times. So thank you guys for your patience so far, and please enjoy lunch, and we'll see you in just a little bit.